member of our series due to being here from a class or just hearing about us in some way. Please know that we're here every single Tuesday. There were some schedules up at the front about what we're talking about every week. We have food every week, and you're free to join us to talk about some different amazing New York Times articles. And a really exciting feature today, since this is a partnership with the New York Times. In addition to our moderator, who's Holly Morganelli, she works in the library. She is FIU's Global Learning Librarian. We also have the author of today's New York Times article, Ian Urbina, with us via Skype. And I'm very excited for this session. I'm going to turn it straight over to Holly, who's our moderator, and I will just be around to help.
Hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thanks to Professor Carter for including everyone in this session. Oh, sorry. Okay, is this better? As Eric mentioned, I'm the Global Learning Librarian, and I wanted to introduce the topic and kind of explain why I chose this and why I became interested in it. I have lived and traveled abroad throughout the developing world, and when I was living and traveling in Africa, I became aware of some of these kind of Outlaw Ocean codes regarding shipping and seas. And when I lived in Qatar in the Persian Gulf, I became very aware of the labor rights issues and the issues with inhumane conditions for workers and the deceptive recruitment practices, as they're termed, that happen in the construction industry. And it's very similar to the issues discussed in this article. And it's also something that attracts people from the same regions in South and Southeast Asia. So it kind of rang true for me when I was in Qatar. I tried to do some work to combat this and was involved in some activism. So I was very interested for that reason. I also think it's such an interesting global topic because the seas are kind of unregulated international territory, whether or not they should be or whether or not that can possibly change. And these issues, such as these problems in the fishing industry, really affect multinational corporations, as we can see with the pet food industry, as you've read in this article. And so I thought it was perfect for a global learning topic. Now, I wanted to also mention that you will have a follow-up article sent to you, which was published in the fall issue of the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and it will explain a lot about how you can engage with this issue and get involved, because this is something that's just being brought to light now that didn't have much attention in the past. And so if you're interested in kind of getting involved and getting active in combating some of these human rights abuses at sea, you can read about it in that article. And I really wanted to thank Ian Urbina for agreeing to be here. I think this is such an amazing opportunity, and I was really blown away by the Outlaw Ocean series. I really enjoyed all of it. I don't know if you were able to view the article online and see some of the video content, but coincidentally, an old friend of mine, Alexandria Garcia, also worked on the videos for this series too. So she saw that I was interested in it and contacted me about it too. So that's how this session came to be. And I want to thank everyone for submitting questions. And I think I'm going to start by, I selected a few questions from your questions which were sent to me. And I'll start by asking a few of those to Mr. Urbina, and then maybe sending the mic around with your thoughts and questions for him after that.
Since Holly's addressing most of you who are here from one class, if you're here not from the class that's already read this article, we did have some copies available. It's an abridged version. It's the first few pages. At the top of that copy, there is an NY Times link with the entire thing. So if you're not from the class who's read this and you want access to the whole article, you can get one of the copies. And if you use any of your devices to go to that link, you can access the whole article.
Okay, so I think the first question I'd like to start with is, what sparked your interest in this subject, and how did this series kind of get off the ground and get started?
So just, if I don't hold the audio up like this, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So about a decade and a half ago, I was in grad school and working on a doctoral dissertation, and I was somewhat burnt out. And so I sort of fled the program for a little while and took a job on a ship. And it was just, kind of a whimsical idea, getting away as far as I could from the cold winters of Chicago. And that was sort of my first real introduction to seafarers. Truth be told, we didn't get out on the water very much. We were stuck in port for much of the time. But it did sort of expose me to this universe of seafarers and the sort of strange lives they lead. I was in the anthropology doctoral program, and so I sort of had that lens that I was viewing the world, and I kind of backed my way into this other tribe of almost a diaspora tribe of people. So I always wanted to get back to that space, if you will, and sort of the people that work there and live there, wherever they might be. So I've been at the Times since '03, and I just was in conversation. I do project reporting, so sort of long-term investigative stories, and I pitched the idea of us really doing an aggressive global look at all that happens out on the oceans.
And do you think there's a reason that this topic hasn't been making headlines on CNN the way that the Somali piracy issue has? Because it seems just as extreme, and it's in the same vein.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are almost two universes out there. There's, when it comes to the topic of violence, specifically, and violent crime, there's the universe that affects wealthy and mostly Western parties, and that's the Captain Phillips style piracy. That is hugely consequential. Those are humans that are being kidnapped and sometimes killed. But the reason it gets more attention is that there's a lot of money at stake, and most of the victims are, Western. And so we know about that sort of violence, even though it's far more rare, and in many ways less acute than the other realm of violence. The other realm of violence is that which occurs against mostly non-Western victims. They're more often, it's against a smaller order of ship. So these are not the huge kind of container ships or the huge tankers or the that have massive companies behind them. These tend to be the smaller, kind of coastal vessels. The crews tend to be predominantly, even the officers tend to be Sri Lankan, Filipino, South Korean, Burmese, and the violence against those folks, be they on merchant marine vessels, carrying everything from gasoline to, produce, all the way over to, and I would say in some ways even more violent, to the fishing vessels. That realm of violence is far more pervasive, far more acute, and far less reported. And there's just no infrastructure for reporting it. There's a whole bureau in Kuala Lumpur that is funded by the large shipping companies, and its primary goal is to track violence against, the Captain Phillips style ships, the big ships that bring us, your tennis shoes and your microwaves. But there is no mechanism that's global, nor is there any law that mandates the reporting on the type of violence that unfolds against this other realm.
Okay, and kind of along those lines, did you find when you were reporting that sort of the reluctance of maybe nation states and governments and multinational corporations like Nestle that you named in this article, did that make it more difficult for you to kind of complete your investigative work?
And the audio dipped out in the beginning of the question, if you'd restate it.
Oh, the reluctance of, for example, the Thai government to take responsibility for any of this, and corporations that benefit from this in the pet food industry to take responsibility, did that make it more difficult to complete your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, the reluctance comes easier in this realm than it does in other realms. And by that I mean, before I started on this project, I did a long investigation of, you'll probably remember the factories that collapsed in Bangladesh and thousands of workers were killed. Those were garment factories, primarily shirts and shoes. I went for the paper there to look at the problem of worker safety in those factories, and specifically look at where the U.S. government gets its clothes. And it's the same factories as Walmart and everyone else. And one thing I found was that, companies and governments look the other way, including when it comes to garments in, sweatshops in Bangladesh, and the U.S. government included. But those factories are located on land, and there are, human rights and labor groups that are bird dogging the relevant players, and there are just people around, Now take that and put it out 500 miles at sea, and, have the vessel where this is occurring be flagged to one country, owned by another, crewed by 40 guys from, 7 different countries, in international waters for which, to the extent that there's any law, the law is very complicated. Okay, so you overlay that level of complexity onto kind of old school sweatshop issues, and it becomes somewhat easy for companies and governments to not get involved. I'm not letting them off the hook by any means. I'm just sort of trying to highlight that, everyone is complicit here. This space in particular is a bit more complicated than any other one that I've seen.
Okay. And it's more complicated because of the geographical location out in the sea, where it's harder to regulate things for the most part? Is that why?
Well, that's one of the reasons, right? So it's the space. You're out there in international waters. But the other reason is a system that emerged, in the 30s, largely in response to Prohibition in the U.S. And it was a system where before the 1930s, most states flew the flag of the country where most ships flew the flag of the country where the ship was built and mostly crewed, So then we had Prohibition, and sailors and cruise liners and everyone on boats wanted alcohol, and American ships wanted to serve alcohol. So they thus began a popularized movement toward flying the flag of a nation that's not your own. And now, I may get the number wrong, but it's upwards of 70-80% of ships out there fly a flag from another country than the one that they have nothing to do with the country. And there's a market system, and these flags are businesses. And so the business that offers the cheapest prices, the least regulation, the least rules, the least red tape, are the ones that, if you're a ship owner, you're going to incline towards, most likely. And so part of the reason that this space is distinctly complicated, it's like if you had a sweatshop in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and it made Nike shoes, but it was on diplomatic territory, and so the local law enforcement had no jurisdiction to go there, and even if they did go there, the owner of that factory could decide to obey the laws of South Korea or North Korea or Kiribati or the Solomon Islands. They could just choose whose laws they wanted to follow. That's what you have in shipping.
And do you think if we can't fully stop this, there might be a way to prevent some of the human trafficking issues and some of the conditions on the boat, at least, to improve the situation?
Yeah, I mean, there's no silver bullet, as you say, to any of these problems. There are a lot of incremental and potentially effective steps that can be taken, some of which are already emerging. On the specific issue of trafficking, so by that is meant the use of largely undocumented labor on boats who are distinctly susceptible to abuse, and specifically in the South China Sea and on Thai vessels. There's a lot happening. So, there's a lot of pressure that can be brought by governments. So in this case, say the U.S. government has a lot of sway over Thailand because the U.S. is a big consumer of its products. And so the State Department can put pressure on Thailand to clean up its act. which means, exert better control at your ports, know who's getting on the boats, know who's getting off, know where those boats are going. And, not to fall into the weeds here, but there are methods for doing that. It's not impossible. But they're pressure players other than the government, right? There's you and I, right? We're consumers. And consumers can exert, especially, I think, increasingly so in the modern world, consumers exert, in some ways, more pressure in numbers. When they act in numbers, they can sometimes exert more pressure than governments even can. And so, you've seen the fair exchange coffee, and you've seen the sort of foodie movement that seeks to sort of know more about where food comes from. Often that's for health reasons, but sometimes it's for labor reasons. That sort of movement is beginning to emerge in the maritime realm with seafood. Again, it initially started over concerns about environmental and dietary, kind of, is this really the type of fish they say it is, and is it coming from a place where it was legal to be caught? And were any dolphins netted at the time of the tuna being netted? This is what started that movement. But now the movement's starting to look at actual labor concerns too. What was the status of the guys? And these are mostly guys. Seafaring is a very male world. What was the status of the workers on that ship?
Speaking of the workers, you mentioned on Twitter that more than 50% of workers surveyed reported that they witnessed their boss killing a coworker, and they're working 20-hour days, or they're on rat and roach infested ships, and they're not getting proper nutrition. So this is actually lending itself to a student question. When you spoke to them, what was their reaction? Did they seem traumatized? How was it for them getting used to life off the fishing boat after everything they experienced? I know you touched on that with your interview, your writing on Mr. Long, but in general, with other experiences you had with people, can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, the survey you mentioned is a survey that was conducted in 2009 by the UN. It was a survey that was, interviews with about 50, 60 ex-deckhands who had come from Thai vessels in the South China Sea. And what it found in terms of the prevalence of murder corresponded with what I heard separately in 4 or 5 dozen interviews with fleeing deckhands and current deckhands. It's a funny thing. Humans are resilient animals, and we all live in our own bubble. And so one of the challenges of the reporting was, or one of the goals was, we had seen good reporting before about the problem of forced labor on these boats, but very little of it had actually attempted to get out on the water and to actually get out on these, so-called slave boats. And so our goal was to try to get out there and actually directly interact with folks who were in the present tense in this context, not just fleeing folks. So that was an elaborate process. It took a lot of time, but eventually on one boat, the one that we highlighted in the story, we spent some good time with these guys, and they're mostly young guys. The majority of them were under 20. These were 40 or so Cambodian boys and men. They were on a Thai flag vessel. This is a vessel that was a purse signer, a certain type of fishing vessel. To a large degree, those guys are not thinking high altitude like you and I and all of us are thinking now and are discussing. They're in the thick of it. And so they're just surviving one day to the next. And they're also still in this sort of floating jail cell. So they have to be very cautious about what they say. So the conditions on the boat were just horrific. But to talk to these guys, they don't complain much. The crew boss, who is kind of the authority figure who runs the crew, was always around and sort of looming. And the captain is on an upper deck, 2 floors up. He sees everything, but he can't hear the crew. And there's a dichotomy there also in that all the crew were Cambodian and all the officers were Thai, and very few of the officers spoke Khmer, the Cambodian language, and vice versa. So it's a complicated situation, and there is a real sort of fear that you can sense among these guys, but their willingness, I would say their ability to offer too much detail on their desire to get off the ship or the farcical nature of the debt that they owe, it's a joke. They owe a debt. The debt gets them on the ship. Once they go off to sea, there's no bookkeeping. It's not like you can check in and say, hey, Captain, how close till I'm done with my debt and can get off. You get off when the captain wants to get you off, and that could be, 6 months, that could be 2 years. Now, on the other hand, when you talk with folks who've fled the ships and they're in a safer context, that's when you hear the stories in real detail. And that's also when you see fairly acute PTSD, really scarred people. And Lang Long was one example of someone who, you meet this guy and any of you would see him and his sort of 1,000-mile stare, and you would realize he's a pretty broken human. Something pretty bad has happened to that guy. So one of the challenges with him was just getting anything out of him, while also being sensitive to his situation and not pushing too hard, because you could cause him to lapse.
And there's another student question. Do the families of those who are held captive or have been kidnapped on these ships have any way of rescuing or paying for their freedom?
So again, these ships is a broad category. So just for our discussion, we'll just think specifically, because this is not distinct to the South China Sea. It's just a good place to tell this story. You go to the Falkland Islands, there's a patch of really horrific vessels off that coast. You go to the coast of Nigeria, you'll find the same. Different players, different, overseers, different economics, but the same basic indentured slavery going on many of these boats. In the case of the South China Sea, it's distinct in that most of the people on those boats are trafficked labor. Thailand is an almost middle-class country. It's got less than 0.5 unemployment. So Thai people don't need to take the crap jobs. They don't need to work as prostitutes or seafarers. That's why imported labor is brought in. And they're mostly Burmese, but they're also Cambodian. Many of them are Myanmar. You've seen a lot of stories recently about, our Rohingya, which is a subgroup that's fleeing Burma. You've seen a lot of stories about the Rohingya people getting stranded out in that water. So the reason for the long lineup is because these folks are undocumented and are coming long journeys illegally, invisibly across borders, they're doubly invisible, right? So you take someone who's invisible, they're an undocumented worker, you bring them into a foreign country, they have no papers, they don't speak the language. Now you put them on a boat, and then you disappear them over the horizon. So the families back home are typically, in broad brushstroke here, poor villagers who don't read, write, for the most part, and have no way of knowing where their uncle or their brother or their father has gone, or their mother, their sister, their cousin. And so for the most part, they have no idea what came of those folks until they see them return. In the rare case, you've got these organizations like the one we worked with that's mentioned in the story that are, human rights organizations, labor organizations that are based close to the docks, and they essentially run a modern underground railroad, where they're trying to get these people back home. And this is a regional problem. So we were in Borneo, we were in Indonesia, we were in a little, island in the middle of the South China Sea called Natuna, jumped all over the region, and people were jumping ships in all these places. A lot of them drowned. Those that make it are now in some netherland and some random island in the middle of some foreign place, and they have to figure out how to get home. And that's where these NGOs, these advocacy groups, to the extent that they exist, will get involved and will try to sort of hide them because the traffickers will come looking for them. and then try to help them work their way back home.
Does anyone have any questions that have come up? Okay.
Testing.
Okay, I had a question. When the subject of, we were talking about what is relevant in news, as far as like with the Western world, are we really, you're talking about the Captain Phillips kind of stories compared to these kind of stories, these smaller boats. Is there any way that we can make these issues more noticed in the Western nations like America or anything like that? If so, where are we currently in this process and what is next?
And just so I answer the question you're actually asking, when you say any way that we can make these more noticed, do you mean we journalists or we, the consuming public, you guys?
How about journalists? So,
let's see. Number one, you got to be lucky, like I am, to be at an outlet that has enough money to cut a guy like me loose for a year and a half and travel to 10 countries and go looking for these stories. So the economics of journalism and the economics of the sort of web online democratization of journalism is really problematic. The democratization of journalism and online news is great in many ways. It's also killing the bottom line of larger institutions that are somewhat needed, I would argue, because without a large institution, you don't have large money. Without large money, you can't invest in these kinds of projects. This thing, I don't know, I'm kept away from the numbers, but this costs in the millions to produce, just in terms of everything you can imagine. The planes, the boats, the staff, the photographers, the videographers, my salary, and I'm not producing copy for the paper, all that. So I do think, it's an argument for the consuming public, readers like yourself, to think about where the value of institutions, not just the Times, but just AP, these big old guard journalistic outlets that are doing this kind of public service, deep dive, investigative journalism. I think, when you have the option of reading something for free that's been circulating the web or reading it over here, these are political decisions you make. So I do think that's one thing. I do think you also need editors to have the wisdom to say, yeah, this is an investment. It may not deliver returns for another year, 2 years, but it's worth it, and even though we have to kind of constantly be sprinting with the 24-hour news cycle and to keep up with CNN and AP and HuffPo and all these players, we also should set aside some reporters who go long, if you will. And so I think, that's one thing that journalists and journalistic institutions need to be reminded of. And readers need to, when they see things that they think is really good, important, useful journalism, they need to speak up, publicly in social media, directly to the institution. That makes a difference. Because these institutions are listening to readers and gauging how they decide their coverage based on how stories do, in terms of traffic and attention and response. But the last thing I would say, just as an individual reporter, I do think you need to be willing to take a chance. You need to be willing to put yourself. And there are a lot of other reporters that do this far better than I am. This is not me kind of patting myself on the back. I think you need to be willing to take on stories that are tough in many ways, both the reporting of them and then also the telling of them. How do you tell a story so that it doesn't read like a lecture? Because people don't want to read a 5,000-word lecture. They may read a 5,000-word story, and along the way they may learn some things. You give them space, you do it fairly and broadly so that they can actually have space for an alternate view, one that give them the ability to decide for themselves to some degree. You're not going to give them so much space so that they may come to the conclusion that slavery is a good thing. I mean, there are limits on how you frame things, but you are going to say, look, lay it out there in a way that shows the true complexity of the real world.
We have another question.
Hi, I was wondering, are there any fair trade organizations stepping forward to combat any of these employment issues on the boats?
So it's always a little dodgy for reporters to get in the realm of sort of like listing advocacy, because that's where we're not supposed to be. We can sort of describe, we shouldn't prescribe too much. So I can descriptively tell you who exists, and from reporting who seem to be, what organizations are out there that seem to be doing, A, they're committed to this for the long haul, B, they're doing pretty deep and consistent work on it, in the way that you're asking, which is sort of an applied. There's a group called ILRF, and I think it's called International Labor Rights Forum, is what it stands for, that works closely with Greenpeace. I grew up thinking Greenpeace was just Save the Whales, and it is that. But in the last, decade, 5 years, they have actually branched out a lot more into labor issues in the maritime space, on the oceans. And those two organizations, from what I could tell in the last 2 years, have been, some of the most consistent at, really diving into these issues and sticking with them, and not just sort of in an academic way, but also in an applied way, in that they're doing their own investigations, they're engaging with Congress, they're advising about legislation, they're holding, kind of platforms, and they're advising consumers on better or worse ways to make your consumer decisions. So those are sort of big transnational organizations that are doing a lot on this. And then, there are a lot of organizations that are far more localized. And there's one that's mentioned in the story towards the end, which is the organization that actually rescued the guy who was shackled by the neck, Langlong, on one of these ships. And this organization operates on a shoestring budget. It has 7 staff. They're right there in Songkhla, which is a port town in Thailand, and it's just 6 Thai human rights workers who essentially rescue folks as they come running off sometimes out of these ports and hide them out and move them through the country and try to get them back. And in this case, they actually put a guy on a boat with a bag of money to buy Langlong's freedom when they heard about him being shackled. So the name of that organization is in the piece. It depends on which way you want to go, a transnational or a very highly local group. But all of these organizations are plugging in different ways.
Any more questions?
And just, sorry, the name of that organization, I was blanking on it, is Stella Maris. And they have chapters all around the world, but the one that I worked with directly was the one in Thailand.
I have a question back to what you mentioned earlier about the returns on a story like this and how the paper thinks about that. Generally a corporation has a bottom line, which I guess would be measured in like readership. But there are new models of corporations where there's more like a triple bottom line, right? So people and planet as well as profit. How does the newspaper measure the returns on a story like this?
Not exactingly. There's no sort of metrics that are success, failure, threshold, which side of the line are you on? There are general categories, that I think you can intuit, right? A successful story is one that gets read by a lot of people, gets talked by a lot of people, talked about by a lot of people, and not in a negative way, and maybe even affects certain policyholders, policymakers, so conceivably results in concrete change. Now, on that issue, there are different types of sort of public service journalism. There are those, we ran a series not long ago about nail salons, which was an amazing series, and was really focused on the situation of workers in New York City nail salons. That's an example of a really narrow, focused in investigative piece or explanatory piece. And in those cases, they have a very clear target, and you can almost predict the kinds of results that might come from that, and did. So you've got state lawmakers step up and they start drafting laws. You know, NGOs and unions rally around it and they begin pushing through some of the changes that they think are best equipped. The governor weighs in, et cetera, et cetera. When you take on a topic like kind of lawlessness on the high seas, and the high seas represent over 40% of the planet, you get diffuse pretty fast, right? So the ability to measure the metrics of impact on a series like this get tougher. Clearly, public education, you know, the opportunity to talk to a room full of smart people like now, is one metric of impact. You know, you guys read the piece, and then you showed up here on your own time and want to learn more. That's impact. But it's not as measurable in the same way. And so these stories, I think, the ones that are really broad, but nonetheless attempt to find virgin snow topically, focus on new topics that haven't been covered that way before. These are a little bit harder to measure the metrics it does. But the paper, you know, it's a business. It has a business. There's a church-state divide. The business side looks at ad revenue. It looks at click traffic. It looks at chatter. It looks at awards won. These are all sort of concrete metrics of stories. And the news side, you know, looks at some of the same things and then makes a decision on you know, whether to continue with a series or to continue with series like that.
Another question?
Hi, I just have a quick question regarding the reaction of businesses that were mentioned in this article. Did they have any response to it, and did they indicate any interest in changing or improving their methods?
So I'll give a preview that I'm supposed to be producing a short piece on this, or a couple pieces, just on sort of cobbling together various developments in lots of different fronts. Because the series, as you know, covered. There were four. The series is not done. First of all, you know, there are more stories coming. I haven't written them yet. I'm in the middle of reporting them, but there's more to come, and we'll probably run through next year. But the four big stories we put out cover a huge variety of topics, and so they're different developments depending. But just sort of a preview. There's a lot happening on the Hill. There's legislation that's aimed at fighting human trafficking, and that is incorporating some of the findings of the series into the way they craft that legislation. There's a hearing coming up soon, probably in the next month or so. There is Thai Union. You asked about companies. So the biggest seafood company in Thailand is a company called Thai Union. They reacted very strongly to the story that you read. They have begun making a number of changes. I would say the most noteworthy of which is they claim, now I'm skeptical about certain things, and so are some advocates, but their claim is that they are going to fully stop using transshipment, which is kind of a wonky term for when boats stay. It's a system where basically, because we've fished out all the fish that are close to shore, ships have to go much further out. And the economics get tougher and tougher the further out you go, because your big expense is fuel. So if you go really far from shore, at some point it becomes financially infeasible unless you can stay out there. Okay, that's transshipment. It's a system whereby the ships can stay out at sea and they just keep fishing back and forth, right? And what happens is a mothership, a so-called mothership, is a supply vessel that's faster, lighter, and leaner, and it goes out, it brings men, tools, fuel, ice out to the fishing vessels, and then brings their catch back. And then the fishing vessels stay out there and just keep fishing. Transshipment is a big problem from a labor perspective because those are the ships where people get enslaved, where they essentially are stuck there for sometimes years on end. And there's very little way to inspect them and to know what's going on these ships because they just stay out there. They never come in port, or they rarely come in port. So Thai Union and the story sort of highlighted this issue. Thai Union says it's transitioning away from transshipment. It's only going to get its fish directly from fishing boats, and as such, it's going to impose better inspections on the boats coming in. The problem is when you start really pinning them down on their wording, you start realizing that there's some mincing of words going on, and they're excluding a whole order of vessels that, so they're buying a lot of fish from other vessels that are not their own, and they're saying, hey, look, we buy, half of our fish from Trimarine, a big company, and we can't impose our rules on them. So, what they do is what they do. And Trimarine has no intention of moving away from transshipment. So Thai Union comes out and says, we're not going to use transshipment anymore. Well, it's more complicated than that. And they're not also referring to the ships that are working in foreign waters. They're just referring to the ships, their own ships that are operating in Thai waters. And so you really have to kind of pin these folks down and press them and press them and press them and look for where there might be a sleight of hand. And there usually is. But all that's to say, there is progress. Nestle actually called 5 minutes before this interview and said they're getting there's a class action lawsuit that was brought a week ago, 2 weeks ago, based on the story, and brought by a group of cat and dog food buyers, who bought quote-unquote slave-produced Nestle Fancy Feast, for their pet, and they're suing the company in a class action suit. It's really a shame maneuver. It's not a suit that would ever win, but it does exert pressure, and Nestle has to sort of respond to the claims that are in that suit. And so, I'm writing a story that will touch on a lot of these things, and Nestle called and said, can you hold the story? We're going to get you a response to that litigation soon. But this is what the impact looks like. It's a little bit here, a little bit there.
Were you ever a little bit worried that the powers that be would become angry you were doing this reporting? I'm thinking of the constant gardener, I guess, but.
Maybe I'm just sort of impetuous and oblivious and stupid, but I can't cite many times when I actually got scared in that way. I think, I'm afforded by a number of things. One, I'm a white guy. I'm actually Puerto Rican Latino, but to the captain 200 miles from shore, I'm a wealthy white dude that, they probably don't want to mess with because I'm American, and it would bring them far more headache to mess with a New York Times reporter than to just leave them alone. And it would just bring so much bad press and so much bad attention that it's not in their interest. And that affords me a lot of protection that is not afforded the guy to my right, who's a 17-year-old Burmese guy with no name, doesn't speak the language, and can disappear tomorrow and no one will notice, right? So I am constantly protected in a story like this from a deliberate action by that. Now, maybe my wife and my 11-year-old often argue with me on this and say, you think you're more protected than you are. But so far, I think I'm winning the argument because here I am. I'm fine. I've come back from a lot of these types of stories. And I've never been, harm has never come to me. The real threat in this story was the conditions. These are dangerous, industrial operations. The boats are insanely dangerous. They're slick, they're dirty. The floor is moving 10 feet up, 10 feet down like an elevator all the time, rocking side to side. These are not your Navy ships, where everything is OSHA certified. You've got huge, kind of heavy industrial machinery spinning around on the ship that we stayed on, there was a really mean dog. I know that sounds weird, but it was a huge concern because it was the one hesitation they had to letting us on board, because the dog was vicious and had just puppies, and we had a photographer on, and they kept saying, that dog will attack you if you're. And so, we always had to figure out where the dog was. Were we on the right deck? And it's the dog can charge you, and you trip and you fall overboard. And there were times on the ship where virtually everyone was asleep, and the photographer and I were awake. On the Thai ship with the Cambodians, we had a translator with us who happened to be female, which we had tried to avoid because these are risky situations. These guys have not seen women in sometimes over a year. We're hugely outnumbered. There are 40 of them, 2 of us. You just don't want the liability of what can happen and the complexity. But she was an amazing translator, fearless, and she was the person that came with us. She got insanely seasick. I think it may have been something more than seasickness, but she was barely conscious. And so we were kind of having to carry her around the ship because we didn't want to leave her by herself wherever we were. We brought her. And, I know this is more detail than you're looking for, but it's the reality of the threats where, at some points, the most scared I became was at one point when Adam, my photographer, who's a 6'2" guy, I'm 6'2", we both were carrying Oi, the translator, around the ship. It was dead of night. Only the dog, the captain, our deckhand, and us were awake. And we had to cross this one little ledge to get from the back of the boat to the front of the boat. And Adam almost fell, and we almost dropped Oi in the water. If we had dropped her, she'd be dead. They would not turn around. She'd be gone. And that was the scaredest I ever was the whole time, thinking, wow, these are really dangerous places. But I never felt it. There was one time on a story when we were interviewing some escaped migrants who in Borneo, in this far-off woods in Borneo, where we'd heard of this guy, and an NGO person brought us to his hut, and it was on this rubber plantation. It was really, really out there, and somehow, I think that the policeman in Borneo was tied with the traffickers. But within 10 minutes of sitting in this guy's hut, 2 fairly thuggish guys showed up and just reamed us and essentially said, get the hell out of here or we're going to kill you. And they didn't want us talking to this guy. Again, for some reason, I didn't feel like they were going to kill us. I really worried for the guy we were interviewing, because when we left, what the heck was going to happen to him? We left, but that was the second scaredest I was in this project.
Thank you for sharing your stories with us. I think there was another question over here.
First of all, I want to thank you for putting a face and a voice on this issue, to you and your team. And second, I'm going to do a follow-up question to what she was saying about the companies that we consume products that they make. What can we do as consumers to avoid taking part of that game? And what can we do as global citizens to alert and impact awareness to the people around us?
Say the last sentence of your question again.
What can we do as global citizens to alert and impact awareness to the people around us?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So again, I'm drifting perilously close to the realm of advocacy. So I just want to sort of flag that and say that I will, I should stay a little bit away from that. I can just speak as a person, and we all consume so much stuff. It's 2 years ago, 4 years ago, whatever it was, the New York Times won a Pulitzer for our reporting on the abuses at Foxconn, which is the company in China that makes all our iPhones. I bet you, I have an iPhone right here. Many of you do too. I never pause to think about the conditions, the problem of suicide, the hours, all that of the workers that make it. Like, there's so many products in our life that it's hard to kind of think about this stuff. So I guess the one thing I would say is, maybe choosing a couple of battles, not the whole war, and just sort of focusing on those for starters. And so in the realm of seafood, and I think that, again, I'm intuiting this much like you. I don't have an answer that was given to me by someone, but my sense is step one is you get on the internet and you use the logical search terms to figure out who are the players in that space. So if we're talking about seafood, who are the players, the NGOs in that space who are specializing on the issue of the buzz terms are often what you have to figure out, and this is traceability of fish, tracing where the fish comes from. And that usually, again, it started with an environmental and a foodie concern, but is now taking labor issues into account. And so first, I think you want to see, who are the players, and you read a little bit on their website. You set aside 20 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever, to sort of start schooling yourself on it, figure out who you trust and who has information that seems good. And you find out, okay, organization X, Y, and Z seem to have good information, and they advise, they have a checklist of, sweat-free seafood, but it takes some work, right? And then you look at what advice they offer as to who are the better products to buy and what are some of the kind of questions to ask. When you sit down, are there certain types of fish, for example, that you really just shouldn't, eat because it's just a notoriously bad type of seafood that has lots of problems? These websites are the ones that will tell. So I don't have the exact answer for you, like go to this website or go to that one. But I think within 10 minutes of Googling, you probably can find them. I mean, you have to be a little careful of that space because it's infiltrated by, everyone has interests, right? NGOs have interests, Greenpeace has an interest, you and me have self-interest, and then, kind of corporate players have interests. And oftentimes they are in that space with organizations that are working with them. That's not a bad thing. I'm not implying that, but there are organizations that are working with the corporations to put forward answers to your questions. And then there are organizations that are independent from funding from the seafood industry, and they're offering their own sets of answers. It's always important to suss that out and figure out where that line. In general practice, that's what I would suggest. You just get on there and you start researching it, but you just take one thing at a time.
And regarding this issue, you'll definitely want to read this article that you'll be emailed because it has a lot about the specific organizations working on this issue in the seafood industry. My mom's reaction was that she was only going to feed her cats grilled salmon from now on. I don't know if that's the answer. Wild caught, of course.
But one thing I would say though is, the one thing that is tough with this series is a lot of what's out there already is about environmental. So wild caught, for example, often has no bearing on the labor conditions. And so if you're concerned about the labor issues, then you need to look beyond the purely green stamp of approval or the environmental stamp of approval and look really closely at what is this website or this group saying specifically about the conditions of the workers who got it.
I have one last question. Regarding you said that most of these parts are taking part in the Pacific, right? And right now we have the big environmental issue with the Fukushima radiation spillage coming over from Japan. Now my question is that, are you reporting on which companies are fishing for these fishes in the Pacific that are coming over to the U.S., or are you just reporting on the trafficking aspect of it?
And let me make sure I heard that. So you're asking, am I reporting on seafood that's imported into the U.S., or am I looking at seafood and labor issues generally? Is that right?
Generally in the environmental part, because the Fukushima is a radiation issue worldwide right now, and I know a lot of fish coming from the Pacific over to the U.S. are showing up with lots of radiation, that is something that interests me.
So I'm not looking at all at that issue. It's certainly interesting, but I'm, again, the series was really seeking to highlight, at least initially, the situation of workers and sort of seafarers and labor concerns, and sort of have humans as the driving forces, not as consumers, but as the people that work the space. It very quickly became obvious that you couldn't talk about lawlessness on the high seas or on the oceans without looking at a whole array of lawlessness, including environmental. But the series was decidedly not about specific environmental concerns in the seafood supply chain, because the thought was very important, but there is ongoing coverage of that, and it's not as virgin snow, if you will, as what we sought.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. I think I heard at the beginning that you were in the anthropology department. Is that correct? In Chicago?
That's right.
Okay. I was wondering if your theoretical kind of background in anthropology, some of these broader issues about the world and these kind of global interactions, either through theoretical or applied anthropology, helped you to kind of make sense of this kind of illicit maritime activity or other issues of globalization.
So it's a good question. I think that I would definitely say that grad school made me a better reporter. But the ways that I would put higher up on the list that it impacted me were less specific to having read Foucault and Derrida, or my dissertation advisor Marshall Solins, and more to what grad school in general did for me, which was I goofed around as an undergrad and really only started kind of paying attention and realizing there was a lot interesting happening in class late, junior, senior year. And I realized, wow, I kind of wasted an opportunity here. And so to solve it, I extended my academic years by running off to grad school. And what grad school did was sort of train me to read massive amounts and figure out systems that worked for me for processing the information into a narrative or an organization structure that allowed me to internalize it. And then in reporting, you're doing the same thing. Especially I always wanted to be an investigative reporter who did long, deep dive. I had to go through lots of beats to make it there. But I wanted to do this kind of reporting, which in some ways I think is the closest to academic style research as you can get in journalism, because it's huge undertaking. There's lots of research, a long time. So grad school definitely taught me to read a lot and broadly, and taught me to embrace systems that I found worked for me for that information. I think anthropology, specifically cultural anthropology, I did field work. I was a Fulbright scholar in Havana. I lived in Havana for a year and a half for a year, closer to a year, doing my doctoral research. I did field work in Mexico, and that sort of taught me to how to be a stranger in a strange land, if you will. How to go to a place and recognize that you're a complete oddball and you're vulnerable, and it's okay. In fact, your very duty is to ask dumb questions and just sort of in your own head build your understanding of these people from the ground up, intense conversations with 6-year-olds. I mean, this is what you do to really, and also to embrace your almost queer eye. So when you see something, be it with a seafarer or with a Oaxaca, farmer that you think is curious, you write it down and you follow up and you get an explanation as to what that's about, and things that strike you as compelling or bizarre, you really run with that, and that all came from anthropology, and it's perfectly translated into reporting, because every place you go, you kind of, the saying with reporters is reporters don't know anything, they know people that know things. That's a good reporter. And I don't know very much about anything, but I do know how to be dropped into a place and quickly figure out what's going on, and that's very much like an anthropologist.
Thank you very, very much for being here today and for answering all of these questions. It's a very special opportunity for us in global learning and at the Tuesday Times Roundtable, and I'm very appreciative.
Yeah, thanks.